Hello, everyone. I'm Ricardo Gamboa, the creator and host of the Hoodoisie. We are Chicago's only and the country's only radical live and live stream news show disseminating Black optic and radical perspectives on culture and politics. And we are super excited to be bringing you this teaching series, Liberations in Black and Tan, that was incited by an eruption of racial tensions and brown on black violence that happened last week during the George Floyd protests. So we put this together to bring in Latinx professors from across the country to kind of talk about the issues that are at the root, and to also try and find ways to create multiracial solidarities and Black and brown solidarity. So we're super excited to kick it off with this inaugural session. It features the author of the book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, and the director of the Sam Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Everybody put your emoji clapping hands together for Paul Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the event sponsors, the sound engineers, the organizers, the labor that made this possible, and I'm just so honored to be here, and especially with you, and also with dear colleagues and friends. Some of us have been in kind of informal discussion this weekend. So there's going to be some themes you'll be hearing this weekend, which are kind of the perennial themes. Those themes are really focusing on organizing, social justice, like how we can use history and theory to ground our liberation work, and vice versa. So when we talk about issues of Black and brown solidarity, one of the first things that we have to remember is that this is kind of forbidden knowledge, because we live in a capitalist society, and this is a society that's based upon exploitation. Now, we often talk about, capitalism is based upon competition, but at the bottom, it's based upon exploitation. Capitalism is based upon the expropriation of theft and destruction of indigenous cultures and lands in the Americas. Capitalism is born in slavery of enslaved African-American peoples. Capitalism progresses by dispossession of peoples, all the way back from the English dispossession of the Irish people in the 16th century to the continued exploitation of Native American lands and peoples. So that we are encouraged to be at each other's necks, at each other's throats. We're encouraged by our educational systems, by our political systems, by our governance systems to compete against each other. And on the other hand, so what I try to point out in African American and Latinx history in the United States is that examples of Black and brown solidarity, examples of solidarity between people of the Americas, struggling people of the Americas, are unfamiliar to most of us. I certainly grew up almost completely ignorant of them. These examples of solidarity you're not going to see in Hollywood, television, or film. You're going to see white savior myths, right? This is because, for obvious reasons, the dominant society, and what I mean by the dominant society is the real powers of racial capitalism, do not want us to know about these examples. Again, we're constantly prodded into fighting a war of all against all. And so the concept of solidarity, which I really want us to think about this entire weekend, how do we build solidarity, right? The idea of solidarity is anathema to the people that run the society. And again, instead of solidarity, what they try to do is to shunt us or to maneuver us into things like philanthropy. Instead of teaching people how to fight for our own interests, we nurture middle-class so-called spokespeople, how to be advocates for other people's problems, and then nothing changes. So why is this knowledge about solidarity building forbidden? Why is it not taught? So one of the first things I want to share with you is Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a person who did intersectionality before intersectionality was cool. He was a person who traveled throughout the world, who learned about imperialism firsthand, who learned about anti-colonial struggle firsthand. And he came back to the United States and he started teaching people about what he had learned in Africa, in the Middle East, what he had learned talking with Fidel Castro and other people in struggle, brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and in Latin America. What I learned from studying Malcolm X is that history is really at the centerpiece of what we need to be learning in terms of learning how to get free. This is a moment during 1962 when the Hospital Workers Union 1199 had just emerged, just literally hours before this event, victorious in a strike. And you'll see behind Brother Malcolm is this big marquee. Negro and Puerto Rican communities support Local 1199's fight to end exploitation. And the words that Brother Malcolm is sharing with us is really could be the title of my presentation today. And he's quoting a great Polish American labor leader, Leon Davis, who was one of the real organizers of 1199. And Malcolm is there to be in solidarity and support with the Black and Brown communities in this strike. And one of the main themes I want to share with you this morning is, if we're talking about solidarity, we have to be there for the people who we want to be in solidarity with. We have to take the blows that are meant for them. But the other theme I want to mention to you here is that this is a working class history. Black and Brown peoples are going to be primarily working class peoples. And I want us to think about the implications for organizing. So here you have a strike, you have labor union members, hospital workers, Negro and Puerto Rican who come together in 62, and you have Malcolm X kind of bringing home these lessons about solidarity and political power. Let's think about coalition building, but what are the outcomes? In this case, he's trying to tell us about political power. I come to you today from Gainesville, Florida. That's where I'm joining you from. But every place where we're at today, every place where you're at, where you're watching, we all are living and working and watching on conquered land, an unceded land that originally belongs and still belongs to Indigenous to Native American people. And I want us to remember that, because when we talk about coalition building, when we talk about liberation and Black and Brown solidarity, the hidden histories of solidarity between Native Americans and African Americans is very important. It's really central. Gainesville, Florida was a site of numerous battles, and you can see here in the image on the left, you can see Seminole warriors hiding, waiting to ambush soldiers of the United States Army. This is an example where Native Americans or Seminoles, Creeks, Miccosukes, and others joined together with former slave Africans to fight the United States government. When we think of the roots of anti-Black racism within the Latino diaspora at large, we got to go back to 1492. The Europeans bring ideas of race to the Americas with them. The great African-American scholar Cedric Robinson, in his book Black Marxism, kind of breaks this down. See, the Europeans racialized each other. I mentioned earlier the English going into Ireland and stealing their land, murdering people by the tens of thousands, deporting many Irish people. Well, the English did that to the Scottish people as well. The Western Europeans did that dispossession to the Eastern Europeans. And in 1492, the Spanish kingdom essentially unifies behind a few different ideas: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim ideology, and anti-Black ideas. 1492 is the year that the Spanish consolidate and drive the last of the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula, and then launch this devastating conquest of the Americas almost at the same time. So again, throughout the weekend, when we think about where these roots of racism come from in our communities, this is what we need to really understand. This is something that didn't exist in the Americas. It's the Europeans that brought it over. Now, how can we do this work, though, of solidarity? And I'm going to suggest a few different, possibilities and methodologies throughout history. One of them, Malcolm X brought to us in the beginning. Self-activity, go on strike, get in the streets, engage in an action. What I've learned in 30 years of organizing, and I started as a United Farmers organizer in the late 80s and early 90s, is that when you're talking about building solidarity between groups, whether they're African-American and Latinx or any groups, self-activity and action is really the key. I mean, it's great to sit around a table and to talk about each other's feelings, but that ain't gonna cut it. What cuts it is action. Get involved in an action. Show up for someone else. Again, take the blows for them. Be there for them. In this case, Martin Espada, one of our greatest living poets, he does this work all the time. And I highly encourage you to pick up his works. See, this is radical intersectionality. He's connecting the struggle against slavery, the struggle against indigenous exploitation, and he's making it work together, and he's connected to the Nazi Holocaust, right? And so he's doing a lot of solidarity work in his poetry. And you don't have to be a labor organizer, you don't have to be in the streets if that's not where you can be, especially during this time of pandemic. Many of us have compromised immune systems, but you can write, right? You can share in many ways. Here's another example of solidarity practices. And now we're going back a century or more than a century, the Reverend Lena Mason. And what I found in the research for finishing this book is that within the African-American political communities, and there is a long history of what I call emancipatory internationalism. And so in the 19th century, one of the manifestations of this is African-Americans writing and supporting liberation struggles in Mexico and Central America and Latin America. And Black writers and organizers like the Reverend Lena Mason, and here she's writing from Fort Scott, Kansas, recognizing that their freedom, their liberty, their possibilities in life are intimately connected to the struggles of, in this case, Cuban liberation fighters. The other thing I wanted to do in African-American and Latinx histories in the United States is to place the working class cultures and movements at the centerpiece of U.S. history. And the reason that's important is it's important to understand how we got to this place. The freedom that we do enjoy today, the freedoms, limited as they may be, come about because of our ancestors in struggle. They don't come about because Alexander Hamilton loved us. They don't come about because George Washington had our best interests in mind. Our freedoms and our democracy and what we have don't come about because Thomas Jefferson thought so highly of us. In fact, just opposite. All of the people I mentioned, Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, had no love for us. We had no future in their world except for as beasts of burden, except for as impoverished, exploited people. And we need to realize that insofar as we have any rights in this country, it's because we have had ancestors courageous enough to struggle. I don't expect you would know who these individuals were because I didn't know until much later in life. On the left, though, is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who you may follow, was just awarded, I believe, a Pulitzer Prize, a century overdue for her work in unearthing lynching. On the right is General Antonio Maceo, one of the greatest revolutionary generals of all time. But what brings them together? Ida B. Wells Barnett does a lot of work in Chicago in the day, back in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Antonio Maceo fights in the field against the Spanish during the Cuban War of Liberation. What brings them together? And in this case, General Maceo had just been killed in battle in Cuba. And African-American communities, including in Chicago, there was a great meeting that was held. And again, think about this, over a century ago, in honor of General Antonio Maceo. And when he was killed by the Spanish, African-American communities all across this country mourned and cried and passed resolutions and promised their support for the Cuban liberation struggle. And yes, Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett the great anti-lynching activist, was there at this commemoration. She was actually on the platform to honor this fallen leader from the Cuban liberation struggle. Now, in my book, Chapter 1, keys on the American Revolution, 1776, but my argument is that the Haitian Revolution is much more important for our purposes today, because it's the Haitian Revolution that abolishes slavery. It's the Haitian Revolution which throws out a lifeline to all of the struggling revolutionary independence movements in the Americas. It's the Haitian Revolution that gives enslaved African people in the U.S. hope. And it's the Haitian Revolution that is the revolution that this country and the leaders of this country to this day don't want you to know about. When we think about building Black and brown solidarity, we have to think about imperialism and anti-imperialism. We're constantly being chased. We're constantly in battle. I was a soldier of empire, by the way, in the mid-'80s. I served in U.S. Special Forces in Central America. I was sent to fight people who often looked like me and had my same last surname, right? But as a young boy growing up in this country, I didn't realize this long history of imperialism. Frederick Douglass here is recentering U.S. history as imperialist history. And until we understand that, we will never be able to talk about coalition building or solidarity. We have to understand what brought us together, the traumas, the tragedies. My family actually fled Mexico one evening in 1914 in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. We were not immigrants. That's a misused term. Number one, and the United States, as my comrade Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz points out repeatedly, we're not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of refugees. We're a nation of former slaves. We're a nation of people who didn't cross the border crossed us. We're an indigenous nation that was expropriated, right? And so Frederick Douglass, again, gives us a sense for the meaning of U.S. history. One of the exciting things in doing this research is that in recent years, we've uncovered a whole cohorts of Latinx abolitionists, Californios, Mexicanos, people who in the West, in Mexico, fought ardently to try to abolish slavery. Again, this is in history. And one of the amazing things, when you read the book, African American Latinx History of the U.S., Chapter 2 is on the Mexican War of Independence. Well, what does the Mexican War of Independence have to do with U.S. history? What it has to do with U.S. history, one of many things, is that Mexico abolished slavery long before the United States did. More African Americans found sanctuary, more former slaves found sanctuary in Mexico, probably than found sanctuary in Canada. But when we use the term Underground Railroad today, we've been so brainwashed to think of Underground Railroad as Canada. Well, there was an Underground Railroad to Canada. But guess what? There was also an Underground Railroad to Mexico, to the Bahamas, to Martinique, to places that were abolishing slavery while the U.S. was growing slavery. In Reconstruction, which politically speaking, for African American people is an incredibly stressful time full of possibility, but it's also the time of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Reconstruction, this is the period right after the end of the American Civil War. It's a time when African American men get the vote, but also immediately white supremacists try to steal the vote from them. It's a time when African descent people are desperately trying to gain some land and freedom. If they can't get 40 acres and a mule, then the plantation owners, the former slaves, are going to seize control back of the society. It's a life and death struggle for Black people coming out of emancipation. But instead of just thinking about themselves, instead of just saying and celebrating and saying, wow, we fought the Civil War, 250,000 of us fought the Union Army to keep the country together. Instead of just pulling back the fences and saying, now we got ours, Black people organized across the entire country to organize in favor and in support of the Cuban liberation movement. And so in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the great white abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison says, okay, y'all, now it's time to kind of fold our tents, realize the historic work we've done. But, I'm tired, y'all. I need to go. I need to rest, right? This is exactly what Black abolitionists refused to do. And instead of resting, they said is we need to think about what would it say about us as a people if we say, okay, we got our own freedom, that's it. When the reality is that millions of people are still in bondage, in slavery, in Cuba, in Brazil. Now, these are some painful signs and images to look at. The next couple especially, I don't want to lie to you. But these are signs that some of us who are older grew up with. This is my father's generation. This was not my generation, but my father had to see these signs. And my family had to see these signs every day of their lives in the 1940s and the 1950s. We have to get beyond this understanding of race in the U.S. as a black and white issue. It's more complex than that. So this was a sign that was ubiquitous in South Florida during segregation. And it really puts it out there, right? It tells us that our people are not welcome here. We're not allowed here. But it also is divisive in the sense that it encourages us to engage in acts of self-hatred. Part of the struggle to become an anti-racist ally is to get rid of that, right? It's a long process. I grew up with the same thing. I grew up believing my own people were lazy. We hadn't done anything. We hadn't contributed anything to society. We stole the jobs of Anglos, but we were also lazy at the same time. I didn't know how you could be lazy and steal someone's jobs, but I knew we did it, right? And until I was able to deal with my own level of self-hatred and what we call the imposter's complex, I wasn't a good ally because I had to deal with my own issues really through engaging in political struggle. When you read a mainstream newspaper like Washington Post or the Tribune or the New York Times in the 1920s, the white-dominated press refers to Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua as a criminal, as a rebel, as a person fighting against a righteous U.S. Marine invasion. But when you read the black press is clear. Hey, this guy's one of us. We all should know the work of W.E.B. Du Bois if we're interested in solidarity work. Du Bois was the author of the greatest work in Reconstruction called Black Reconstruction. That's a book that centralizes the black working class in the abolition of slavery, in the victory of the Union over the Confederacy. Du Bois's argument is that it's the black working class that's the central mover and shaker during what he calls the first general strike in American history. In 1928, Dr. Du Bois was asked to talk about why should the Negro fight to regain the ballot, right? And this was his answer. And I think it's so beautiful because, again, it's part of this long tradition of emancipatory internationalism and black internationalism. He's saying that, it's important to get the ballot back in order for economic survival, but we also have to look to the emancipation of our brothers and sisters in Haiti and Cuba, the Philippines and Hawaii. And we have to be aware about the government of American banks. And this is his jibe, not too subtle jibe, against racial capitalism. And kind of wrapping up, getting into the more recent present, and chapter 8 of my book was a really fun chapter to write because I could do oral histories with a lot of my former students who are now just kick-ass labor organizers. Some of them working on the Smithfield campaign, which eventually became successful. One of the amazing highlights of that campaign was a wildcat strike that occurred that was actually organized by Latino workers who were fighting, who went on strike for the right to celebrate MLK Day. Another kind of high point in chapter 8, I asked, how is it that the United States elects the first black president? And I root that in the 2006 general strike. I argue that it's the organizing energy that comes out of that strike in 2006 that makes it possible to elect Barack Obama to the presidency. I can tell you that the union that's being depicted here in this slide, the Culinary Workers Union, is the single most important labor union in learning about why Barack Obama is elected. This is the union that turns the tide, right? It has 60,000 members. It has members from over 84 countries on this planet. It's really the future of the labor movement.
I think, Paul, one of the things that's sticking out to me was, that sign from, I believe, the 50s, where it was, saying who's not allowed, and it had no dogs on there, presumably not just because they equated black and brown people to dogs, but because people were trying to bring in their dogs into those shops, which means that white people have loved animals more than people of color for decades now. And I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ironies of that sign. Like I talked to my father and my elders about that the last time I was in Houston, and they said, well, and my reputation is, I'm the younger, like, historian person, right? And they said, well, Pablo, here's the thing about that sign. We weren't allowed to go in the front of those stores anyway. And my father, worked in a restaurant that had one of those signs, and he said, I only saw that sign from the reverse because I was inside, he was a busboy. Mm-hmm. And so, but to me, that was a way of trying to, imagine what it was like to be, a parent during that time. Right. You're trying to raise your child with a sense of dignity, a possibility, and then you have to deal with that.
Right. From Anne, how do we find more information about the Underground Railroad to Mexico? I've heard that about 90% of blacks headed north and about 10% went south. But from what you said, it sounds like that percentage is wrong.
Yes, and that's a really good question. We're recalibrating that percentage. We'll probably never know exactly, what percentage, but let me break that down a little more. So in chapter 2 of the book, I talk about that, the Underground Railroad to Mexico. And I list a number of sources. I apologize. I usually would have and what I could do is send a follow-up kind of suggested reading list, Ricardo, which would have some of that information on it.
Let's do it.
And I will do that to break down some more, because a lot of this is newer research that we've kind of rediscovered. What I mean by this is that if you look closely at Black abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s, what I do in chapter 2, people like Henry Highland Garnett, for example, who really rises to that forefront of the anti-slavery movement, Garnett is constantly talking about Mexico, how grateful our people should be to the brothers and sisters in Mexico, and how in many ways, even when you go further in history to Langston Hughes, he writes the great poem, one of the greatest poems in the history of this country, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Langston is on his way to Mexico. He's a fluent Spanish speaker. His father is a successful Black businessman in Mexico. And so, there's a lot of connections in the Black diaspora into Mexico and Latin America.
From Yamale Rodriguez Gruger. And the question is, what do you believe is missing from current Black and Brown solidarity actions? And what can we do to improve or make more impact?
Well, I think what's missing is what we're doing here this weekend. And we're actually, I would look at what we're doing this weekend as a model for kind of plugging in some of the gaps. I'll be honest, by now, I'm a movement historian. And so my answer is going to be, it's going to come from my perspective. I was raised to really hate myself, my people, my background. I was raised to try to think about, how could I assimilate? How could I join the dominant society? And then I read something by Martin Luther King Jr. that said, why would I want to integrate onto a sinking and burning ship, right? And then I started reading things about, hey, my people had amazing accomplishments. And it wasn't just the Aztecs.
Paul, I want to thank you so much for coming here. If you were to give everybody a one-sentence takeaway to sum up what to think, and what would it in the next couple of days, what would it be?
Love yourself, love each other. Take care of each other, right? That's my takeaway, especially in this age of the global pandemic. But that the connection to respecting yourself, to respecting each other, reciprocity, be there for each other. Now it's a run-on sentence, right? I apologize. I'm a historian. I'm not an English professor, right?
This is so great. I'm definitely going to be in touch about bringing you out to Chicago to do one of these workshops the minute this lets up. And thank you so much, Paul. Once again, the book, I'm actually thinking that I want the Hoodoisie to even have kind of like a work group around it, is the African American and Latinx History of the United States. It's sold out right now, but you can pre-order it because Paul is doing it. This shit is catching fire, bro. So go ahead and pre-order it right now. Dr. Ortiz, thank you so much for being here with us.
Latinidad emerged as a label in contradistinction to Anglo-whiteness, whatever it is that it has become now. And the final point that I would like you to leave with today is that to combat racism and anti-Blackness, we need to reclaim Latinidad as the anti-colonial project that it decisively was grounded on Black liberation. If, as Sylvia Wynter has argued, all our present struggles with respect to race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, the environment, are the result of colonial structures that define people as human or lesser human. That is, through a colonial category of citizenship that are based on race, ethnicity, bodily ability, or what I call belonging versus unbelonging. One significant effect of the colonial classification of human versus less human is the emergence and dominance of an archive, a repertoire of images and ideas that define humanity only in as much as it approximates European values, cultures, and race, which leads to a simultaneous differentiating of non-white populations in colonies as less human. So fast forwarding to the present day United States, these categories of belonging and unbelonging that are rooted on colonial processes determine who goes to prison, who deserves protection under the law, who gets pulled over by the police, who must show identification in public spaces, who can be left out of institutions and archives and sites, who gets to nap in public or run in public or watch birds in public without being bothered. If the human or those who belong is defined by its proximity to Europe, then the lesser human, racialized non-white, minoritized, immigrant subjects, Black subjects who unbelong are presumed to be expendable, durable, uncivil. In many global North colonial powers like the United States, these dynamics of belonging and unbelonging manifest through a discursive and economic replacement of the category of the enslaved person with that of the immigrant of color, which in some places, in some instances, is, as in Black Latinx, is the same. Right? I am the descendant of enslaved people, and I'm also a Latinx immigrant in the United States. So race and non-citizenship work together. They're intertwined vulnerabilities, as David Hernandez reminds us, that make whole communities susceptible and at times defenseless against constitutional status. So immigrants now perform the labor that Black and indigenous enslaved peoples and Asian indentured servants were once forced to do in the colonies all throughout the Americas. And I'm not talking just about the United States. They also occupy the place of liminal humanity that sustains the various structures of national belonging and border making that maintain our nation. So colonial rule drives migration, and coloniality defines human belonging to the nation and to the world. Immigrant, as deployed in the 21st century, is thus a new category of colonial oppression. Therefore, the oppression of Black people and immigrants must be confronted together. They are not separate. Immigrant belonging is almost an impossibility. Now, you may ask, what exactly does all of this have to do with Latinidad, and in particularly with Black Latinidad? So don't get impatient. My answer here would be everything. It has everything to do with Latinidad and with Black Latinidad. You have a country, the United States of America, that became independent from England, but did not end the colonial project. It severed its relationship to England, but kept the same structures of domination. White descendants of the British took over the governance of the land and of the people, and slavery continued to operate as the main source of labor. The US very quickly replaced England as the dominant empire in the region and went on to invade territories and expand its domination. Meanwhile, a revolution was taking place in the island of Santo Domingo. Haitians were fighting for their own freedom and in the process setting the standard for what independence should look like for the rest of the Americas. And you know what the first thing they did was to end the colonial project? They abolished slavery and established universal citizenship for all people, regardless of their skin color. If you ask me what the model for American republicanism and citizenship should be, it's Haiti, not the United States. And revolutions exploded all over the Americas, with Simón Bolívar leading the way in South America. Now, instead of taking Haiti's lead, the United States proceeded to join Europe in bullying Haiti, imposing crippling embargo that to this date has submerged Haiti in international debt. The United States began also to assert its power throughout the region through policies of expansionism and through tactics of bullying that forced new republics to disavow Blackness if they wanted to survive, or else risk the fate of Haiti and be cut off from any kind of exchange, from any kind of political engagement, and from the economy, the global economy. Now take the Dominican Republic, my native land, for example. Dominicans became an independent nation in 1844. A year after, in 1845, the United States sent a commission to assess whether the country was indeed fit for self-governance. The commission's result found that Dominicans were indeed equipped because the country was, quote-unquote, mixed race, and I'm quoting from the original document here from 1845, they are not Black like Haitians. There are enough white people there to govern. Now that logic, the narrative of mestizaje, can save you from dealing with the almighty US empire. Of course, that will make anyone pause, right? And Dominicans were not stupid. They drafted an ideology and a narrative about themselves that would erase and substitute colonial-imposed racial categories with national identity or national label. Words like negro, cobrizo, mulatto, mestizo were replaced with the all-encompassing Dominicano. To mention one's race then became anti-patriotic. And that myth of colorblind citizenship and belonging was eventually fueled by cultural and political narratives of unity that whitewashed Dominicanidad and exalted Hispanic values and intrinsic to the nation. And something very similar happened in Mexico, in Venezuela, and in Central America. In all of this national project, mestizaje, or this idea of a mixed identity, became an effective tool to erase Blackness. In the Caribbean, men like Gregorio Luperón, who was a Black general and writer, and a little later Jose Marti in Cuba, began to draft manifestos that called for a Latinoamérica Unida, in contradistinction with an Anglo-American superpower. The idea of Latin really emerged as a contradiction to the US empire. The idea of a united identity, a united territory, a united ideology under this rubric Latin, Latino, Latinness emerged in the 19th century as a weapon to protect themselves from U.S. colonial threat. In 1865, the United States finally ends slavery. A country founded on the backs of enslaved people's labor is now having to grapple with the possibility of colorblind citizenship, with the possibility of Black citizenship. As this is happening, the U.S. is back on its expansion horse, and President Grant and others come up with the brilliant idea that what they can do to include Black people in the project of citizenship, of American citizenship, is to expand the U.S. territory by annexing the Caribbean and eventually Central America, and some people were even saying Mexico and South America, to ship off Black Americans off the mainline. And this, my friend, as absurd as it sounds, was a real argument and a proposition that was debated in Congress between 1867 and 1871 and gained a lot of traction even among prominent abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. Not just in the United States, but all over what is now Latin America. They were all trying to make sense of what do we do with Blackness? What do we do with race? Quote-unquote Latin people were defined through the U.S. colonial gaze as inherently weaker and unfit for self-governance due to, and let me quote this from a memo to President Grant, a deficiency inherent to Latin American races. A deficiency inherent to Latin American races. That sounds racist to me. This narrative of difference was often used to justify intervention and expansion over the southern territories of the Americas under the veil of Pan-American cooperation. Expansionists believed the United States carried the burden and the destiny to lead the Americas out of the darkness of barbarism. In the Caribbean, the idea of Latinidad was intrinsically shaped by a preoccupation with Blackness and Black citizenship in the face of U.S. imperial expansion. While over time Latinidad came to signify a predominantly mestizo and Hispanic ethno-race in its conception, the idea of Latinidad was grounded on an understanding of a multiracial citizenship that included and centered Blackness. Caribbean national projects in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico attempted to produce a racially inclusive citizenship that would guarantee national belonging to all people regardless of race. Well, from the benefit on hindsight, we know that these projects of colorblind citizenship could not succeed, right? As they were not able to guarantee equality for people in the face of colonialism and global capitalism. My purpose here is to help us think about Black citizenship through Latinidad and to hold those two concepts together. Now, we have this complicated foundational history in the 19th century through which Latin American identity forms in contradistinction to U.S. empire. In the meantime, and at the end and in the hand of the white Latin American elite, which have always had the power of government and the power of defining the narrative of our nations, the way to propose that difference was to elevate Hispanicity, Spanish language, and the cultures and legacies of Spain as the unifying principle of Latinidad. So think of the three Fs: flamenco, flan, and fiestas. The black roots of Latinidad, the ones that emerged in Haiti and the Caribbean, were slowly hidden and replaced by a whitewashed mestizaje. And so as Latin American migration began to grow towards the United States, that distinction did not disappear. We brought our understanding of both race an identity with us to the United States. We imagine that we're not white, that we're Latinx. We imagine that we're not Black, that we're Latinx. The narrative of mixed race identity is ingrained in our historical and cultural understanding of ourselves as people, and it is what united us across national identities. So coming to the United States is a place that has a radically different racial formation process that is decidedly divided into two major categories, Black or white, is not only confusing for some Latinx, it demands that we choose a side in which we do not see ourselves fitting, and in which we might, quite frankly, not be welcome because for many of us, despite the color of our skin, we continue, as Lopez reminds us here, to be racialized as immigrants, so that even when we might benefit from light skin privilege, we're discriminated against because of our ethnic background or immigrant status. And when we're dark skinned, we're persecuted by both the police and La Migra. I think the first lesson is to understand that Blackness and Latinidad are not mutually exclusive, but rather that in its origins, the process of Latinidad emerged as a project of inclusivity that centered Blackness. That was led by Black people in Latin America, and that was grounded in Black liberation. Then we also need to understand that white supremacy is the product of colonialism, and that therefore every colonized country, from Canada to Chile, operates through the logic of white supremacy. That is a hard pill to swallow, but it is the reality that has brought us to this moment. We have been brought up to believe that European features are more beautiful. We have been brought up to believe that philosophy, literature, history, and knowledge in general comes from Europe. We have been brought up to believe that Blackness in Latin America is located only in the Caribbean and Brazil, and therefore has nothing to do with Mexico or South America. We have been brought up to believe that there is an us versus them when it comes to Black lives and Black struggles in the United States, for we are perceived as foreign. Well, those are lies. As long as we continue to believe those lies, we will lose. Finally, we need to reclaim Blackness and indigeneity within Latinidad. We must center those experiences, learn them, claim them, speak them loudly and clearly, until a time comes that when you say the word Latinx, what is summoned to people's minds is not the image of a white passing Spanish-speaking person, but a Black or indigenous person. I think the time has come for us to reclaim Latinidad as what it was meant to be, an anti-colonial project of unity and liberation centered on Blackness.
So first of all, thank you everybody in the Zoom chat and everybody in our watching on Facebook, and Lorgia especially. What are the things that we can do in the, as US Latinos that are also deterritorialized even further from that history to begin reclaiming in real ways, right? Like in real hardcore ways in everyday interactions, some of that Blackness and indigeneity.
We have been taught and we have been sort of naturalized to experience and to think about colonialism as something that passed, as something that ended, rather than as this continuum. One thing that we can all do, I think, as Latinx people, is to find a moment if it is not every day, at least every week, to learn a little bit more about the different historical processes, the different historical experiences, the different cultural experiences that are part of our fabric, whether it is in the United States or in the particular nations that we tend to trace our ethnic identity. I think that all of this lack of knowledge, right, the way in which the history of indigenous and Black peoples has been purposely, and this is a project, has been purposely silenced by the colonial project, it has had an impact on how we see ourselves, on how it explains why in a country like the Dominican Republic that is majority Black and mulatto, people cannot name their Black history. Perhaps because I'm an educator, perhaps because this is where I navigate, I think that is one very powerful tool. I very much believe that learning and learning through an anti-colonial, ethnic studies centric way can be extremely powerful, and maybe that's why this type of knowledges are always subjugated.
Damn, so learn, you mother effers. So I do want to ask a question that came off of the people watching in on the Facebook Live. One of the questions was, how do you feel about the terms like Hispanic, Latinx, Latino? The exact question is, we got so many terms. How do you feel about it?
I have very little feelings about it. I think that in the nutshell, I'll tell you what I wouldn't want to see. I would not want to see energy be put into creating another term. Not because I think that these terms are great. I think all of these terms are extremely problematic, and they all come out of colonial project, and they all produce erasure. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more important what we do than what we call ourselves. I am really tired about the conversations around labels. I don't think they're productive. I also think that we need to be extremely respectful and generous of how people choose to name themselves. So canceling people because they want to call themselves Hispanic, I think that's not wise. I think we want to hear them out, and I think we want to share how we choose to name ourselves, but that's not going to change the fact that we are sharing, most likely, the same colonial oppression.
What does a future of this type of Latinidad look like? When you imagine it, what do you see?
I'm hopeful. And maybe because I'm an optimist, or maybe because I think if I didn't have any hope, I might as well, not do this. But I'm hopeful in the way in which Jonathan Lear asked us to be hopeful. It's radical hoping. It's not just sitting around and it's not your abuelita hoping and rezándole a la Virgen, though I have a lot of respect for that too, and anyone who wants to pray for me, que lo traiga. But hopeful in the way of the work we do will pay off. It has to. And what I think the future will bring is more and more awareness of the intersections of multiple struggles, just not the intersections within Latinidad, but also outside of Latinidad. How do we relate to other experiences of migration? How do we relate to other experiences of unbelonging? And I think that one of the beautiful things that social media and sort of access to connectivity, if you will, that has allowed is that we are seeing these beautiful ways in which people across the globe are connecting and saying, it's fucked up here too. And this is the way in which it's fucked up here, right? And so we're seeing that with the Black Lives Matter movement, where there are these conversations happening across the globe, really, in places like Germany and Colombia and beyond. And think about the fact that the problem of anti-Blackness is a global pandemic. It is not a local problem, and that it cannot be addressed as one problem, and it needs to be addressed as part of a systemic problem of exclusion, and that has everything to do with exploitation, with capitalism, with colonialism, and so that's where I think that the future is. I think more and more of these intersectional struggles and dialogues and ways of speaking back and creating new spaces for growth.
Thank you so much, Lorgia, for being here with us.
It was my true pleasure.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, gender nonconforming and trans deities, thank you for tuning in to the Hoodoisie. We are Chicago's only radical underground live and live stream news show disseminating Black optic and radical perspectives on culture and politics. And this weekend, we are bringing you a very special teaching series, Liberation in Black and Tan. And we are on our third session for this first day. It is entitled Mexicans in the Middle, Mexicans in U.S. Racial Formation. And our professor for this afternoon is actually gets a special intro because they are my advisor at NYU in American Studies. I wouldn't be doing most of the work that I'm doing right now if it wasn't for them, and I appreciate them so much. They're a professor at NYU of American Studies, and let's give it up for Josie Saldaña.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is, I'm sure, a beautiful afternoon in Chicago, just as it is here. And so I'm grateful for you giving me your time. I was invited by Ricardo Gamboa and the team from the Hoodoisie to try and shed some light on the ambiguous racial standing of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in this country. Currently, there are an estimated 8 million Mexican citizens who moved to the United States, living here undocumented, as a consequence of the devastating impact of NAFTA on Mexicans' small-scale agriculture. The vast majority of those people who emigrated to the United States after that are predominantly of indigenous descent or indigenous and peasant descent. And I'll return to this if there's time at the end of my talk. But I think it's really important, especially in the time of COVID, to recognize the essential work that undocumented workers do on behalf of the U.S. nation. Half of the agricultural workers in California are undocumented, as well as half of those working in meat processing plants. So right off the bat, you can see that being Mexican is a pretty messy business in the United States, being Mexican American. To the average white American, when they say Mexican, they are not really making any distinction between, while they might understand that Mexican Americans are legal, they aren't making any distinction between us when they talk about us. One of the things that I can bring today to our conversation is a deeper understanding of how differences in the colonization of the Americas led to significant differences in how indigenous, Asian, Black, white, and brown people were racialized. In other words, each colonial power, Spain, France, Portugal, England, Holland, imposed its own system of differentiating populations in the Americas that later ossified into racial categories and into the differential treatment of human beings based on race. Today, however, I will be talking about the differences between Spain and Britain, and subsequently after independence between Mexico and the United States. I want to preface this with 3 caveats which are extremely important. I am absolutely not saying that there is no anti-Black racism in Mexico or the rest of Latin America, because there most certainly is. And many of you have just heard from my brilliant colleague, Professor Lorgia Garcia Peña, about the deep history and legacy of anti-Black racism in Latin America. Secondly, because of imperialism, the United States globally, and because of our outside influence on global affairs, even minorities in the United States tend to universalize our understandings of racial formation onto the rest of the world. We tend to think that everyone sees race as we do, that all the world has followed the same patterns of racial discrimination that we have. This is understandable, but this kind of exceptionalism is no less ahistorical than any other kind of US exceptionalism. I am also not saying as a consequence that somehow Spanish colonialism was better than British or Anglo-American colonialism. What I am saying is that Spanish and British colonialism followed very different rules for incorporating their others. And this has had long-term consequences for the legacy of race in both Mexico and the United States. And just as a quick example of this, as I imagine some of you know, Mexico's constitution recognizes that Mexico is a pluriethnic, plurilingual, and pluricultural in the second article. So so it officially recognizes indigenous peoples in that article as the original inhabitants of Mexico. This is a change that was incorporated into the Constitution in 1992 as part of the celebration of celebration in quotations of the quinquentennial of 1492. The Mexican legislature is also just voted unanimously last year to officially recognize Afro-Mexicanos in the second article as well as part of the multi-ethnic nation. This is one example. Like, we would be really hard-pressed to imagine a U.S. Constitution declaring in its second article that we're a multilingual and multi-ethnic country. And what I'm trying to show today is that this is due largely to the differences in how colonialism ruled in both countries, how the Spanish incorporated Africans and Indians into New Spain. But I want to reiterate again, I'm not saying that Mexico is somehow not racist just because these elements are in the Constitution, because as we all know, there is a huge gap between justice and what is instantiated in the law, right? So this is a lecture in 3 parts. The first part is on comparative colonialisms, racial formations in New Spain versus racial formation in Anglo-America, racial formation in the Southwest after the U.S. imperial war of aggression, and white by treaty, the history of Mexican-American racialization in the Southwest and subsequently the country. Okay, so beginning with comparative colonialisms, there are 2 important differences with regard to race that differentiate the Spanish system from the Anglo-American system. Let's skip this. Okay. From the Anglo-American system, and these are principally in how the Crown classified indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. So some of you may have heard of a concept called pureza de sangre, purity of blood. And what pureza de sangre meant in Spain before empire and after for 2 centuries, it meant that people had, even though they had been exposed to Judaism and Islam, they had maintained themselves pure of those false beliefs. So people who had, because remember, Spain itself was coming out of 800 years of Islamic rule under the Moors. And so this is happening simultaneously as Spain is expanding into the Americas. And so for them, pureza de sangre meant that you had maintained your Christian faith. Even in light of these false belief systems. And paradoxically, or perhaps what would be surprising, is that indigenous peoples were also considered to have pureza de sangre, because indigenous peoples, by very virtue of the fact that they had, quote unquote, never been discovered before, had never been exposed to Islam or Judaism. So that put indigenous peoples in the unique positions of being equally pure as Spaniards. So pureza de sangre meant that you had maintained your whole family line free of Islamic or Judaism, free of these false beliefs. So this is why, because Indians were equally pure as Spaniards, this is why Spaniards were allowed to marry indigenous nobility. They weren't just allowed to do so, they were encouraged to do so. And this wasn't just among the elite, this was also encouraged down the rank and file. If you married an indigenous woman, you received land, right? Only the conquistadors, only the very elite received land grants. But if you married an indigenous woman and you were in the lower ranks, you too could receive land. And then there were also disincentives for not marrying your concubine. Like, let's say you were in a relationship with an indigenous woman, the Catholic Church would ban you from using any of the sacraments if you did not marry that woman. So, in order to be able to partake in communion and baptism and et cetera, you were encouraged, you were thrown out of the church if you didn't marry the woman who you were having affairs with, relations with. For the Catholic Church, they saw this as a real opportunity for fulfilling their Petrian responsibility. Upon this rock you shall build my church, of extending the Christian church, the Catholic Church, to the indigenous peoples of the New World. And consequently, this meant that the Catholic priests worked very hard, right? They learned indigenous language, they Hispanicized the alphabets of indigenous language, and then taught these Hispanicized alphabets to indigenous elites, so that indigenous elites could themselves function as scribes of empire, so that you could have communication between, the very small portion of the population that spoke Spanish and the vast majority of the population that spoke indigenous languages. The Spanish crown and church divided indigenous people into indígenas, indios dociles, and those were the Indians that accepted Christianity and accepted Spanish authority, at least pretended to, and those the indios bárbaros, who were those who refused to accept Catholicism or Spanish governmentality. And this is, again, initially the terms pureza de sangre and indios bárbaros were religious terms, but, within a relatively short period of time, they morphed into what we understand them as today, which is biological terms that are steeped in racism. But it's important to remember that they originate in this kind of Christian, this other meaning of racial purity, religious purity. The fact that indigenous people had never been infidels, had never been exposed to Islam or Judaism, and had never converted, meant that they could not be enslaved according to Catholic doctrine, right? Because enslavement was reserved for people who were infidels, who the church had waged crusades against and who refused to convert to Catholicism, and so therefore could be declared infidel. So now this is where enter Africans. So enslaved Africans and Afro-mestizos in New Spain. There's a very important difference between Spanish and Anglo-American enslavement. And again, it rests in the kind of determinant factor that Catholicism played in the colonization of New Spain. The reason why you could enslave Africans from the point of view of the Catholic Church was because they were infidels. They had been exposed to Christ's teachings and had failed to take up Christianity, right? They might be Islamic, they might be Jewish, or they might have other religions. They had had the opportunity to convert to Christianity and they had not taken it, and thus it was, according to Catholic orthodoxy, justifiable to enslave them. Now, let's remember that not only had slavery existed in Europe for centuries, right? It had existed, the name slavery, in fact, comes from Europeans having enslaved Slavs who were predominantly Islamic. So that's where the name slave actually comes from. But the other thing that we often forget is that for the 800 years in which Spain was under Islamic rule by the Moors, the enslavement of Black Africans by Northern Africans had been introduced into the Iberian Peninsula through Islam. And this is important because they had very different attitudes towards African enslaved Africans, right? In other words, they had lived among Africans for a very long time in Spain, and enslaved and free, right? Not every African in Spain was enslaved, and it meant that it meant Catholic orthodoxy never ever assumed that Africans were not fully human. They absolutely were fully human within Catholic orthodoxy, but they could be enslaved because they were infidels. So what happens when Africans are enslaved and brought to the New World is that because the Catholic Church in Spain took its teaching responsibilities seriously, they baptized Africans en masse, either when they were getting onto slave ships or when they were getting off of slave ships. Yes, this is absolutely the height of irony and hypocrisy, but it gave enslaved people something that they did not have in the United States. And this was the right to fully enjoy all of the sacraments. Enslaved peoples, because they were Christian, because they had been baptized as Christian, had the right to enjoy all the sacraments. And most importantly, the sacrament of marriage, which meant that they had the right to freely choose their spouses. And of course, enslaved people, quick studies, the male enslaved peoples immediately began choosing indigenous and Spanish wives because the fruit of their wombs would be born free. This had two very, very concrete effects. The first was that you couldn't separate families just because they were enslaved. In fact, they had the right to sacred union, and therefore you couldn't. And this is really getting into the weeds, but Spain had two different court systems. So an enslaved person could take a case in the Crown's court against their employer because they were if negatively affecting their sacramental rights. And if they lost in that court, they would go and appeal to the Catholic court, and the Catholic court overruled the Crown Court. So there are many cases documented in New Spain where you have the establishment of the family unit as the sacred, even if they're enslaved or mixed, enslaved and non-enslaved families. Now, the other concrete effect is that very, very quickly, there is a huge free Afro-Indigenous and Afro-Mestizo population. By 1710, the free Afro-Mestizo population is 130,000, while the white population, that is Creoles and Peninsulares, are 125,000. And why is this an important big date, like 1710? Because in 1710, New Spain decides to end the importation of any new enslaved peoples. Right. So at that moment in time, it's a very important moment in time, because at that moment in time, when you have roughly 255,000 free Afro-Mestizos and whites, you have an estimated 6 million indigenous peoples in New Spain, just New Spain. What does this mean? It means that those people who we call mestizo in Mexico today are at least as likely to be descendants of Africans as they are to be descendants of Spaniards. I mean, numerically, that just has to be the case. But also, the vast majority of Mexicans living in Mexico today are not actually products of miscegenation. Though Mexico may politically, for all sorts of racist motives against indigenous people, like to portray itself as a mestizo nation, it is actually an indigenous nation with a smattering of mestizos, whites and blacks, living among indigenous peoples. The vast majority of the Mexican population, in other words, did not mix with those 250,000 mestizos and whites, right? It's just numerically, they would have had to be very, very busy to have actually mixed with all of those indigenous people. So the vast majority of Mexicans are what we would consider Latinized Indians. That is, people whose entire genetic makeup is 100% indigenous, but who no longer identify with a specific indigenous ethnicity. What makes a person indigenous in Mexico, even though this too is changing, it's very clear. It's what language do you speak, what clothing do you use, what modes of local governmentality, what they call usos y costumbres, do you practice, and what cargos or charges do you hold, or offices do you hold for your communities. This is how you maintain your indigenous identity, and it's tied to a very specific pueblo. So in other words, there are, more than 1 million Mayans in Mexico. But those Mayans, although they understand themselves to be Mayan, their principal identification is with the town they are from. This is how seriously, these are the Casta paintings, and this is how seriously the Spaniards took racial admixture, right? Even as this painting is privileging all these mixtures as recognized forms of sacred family units, there's nevertheless a very clear, racial discrimination just in the terms they use, right? There's a lot of racializing thought even in this celebration from the Spanish point of view of the castes. The thing about mestizos, right, who are really mestizos, people, what is the race of those who truly are mestizos, who truly are descendants of these mixtures that did happen among some of the population in Mexico? What is their race? Well, that's a really difficult thing to adjudicate. And I mean, in Chicano culture and Mexican-American culture, we have a saying, and that is that we all come from pinto bean families, because like the pinto bean, you will have in one mestizo family every shade of black, brown, red, and white, just like a pinto bean, which also happens to be the bean of choice of the Southwest, not of the interior of Mexico, but of the Southwest. So whereas Spaniards and Indians were considered pure, and therefore Spaniards and Indians, for example, could own land, Castas' rights and obligations were really limited because of the fact that they were mixed. people who were in the middle, people who were castas, could not own land. They could not exercise certain professions or guilds, and they certainly couldn't hold any administrative office. This discrimination against the castas, what these people of mixed ancestry could or could not do, is what caused them to be the major colonizers of the northern provinces of New Spain, what today we call the Southwest. Up to 25 to 50% of all of the settlement in the northern provinces of New Spain were populated by mestizos and Afro-mestizos. They did this because if you moved on to the borderland, as is often the case of the borderland, law was a lot looser, right? You could own land, so you could have your little ranchito. You could hold office. You could vote. Miscegenation, of course, continued in these places, as one would imagine. And so, these Afro-mestizos and mestizos married Indios from these areas, the Navajo, the Apache, the Kiowa, all the Pueblo Indios. So this is the scene in northern New Spain, which will become the Southwest, and at the time of independence. So independence took 10 years, from 1810 to 1821. But when it did occur, the Mexican Constitution declared all males, be they white, indigenous, or free Afro-mestizo, to be equal before the law, and we recognized them in the Constitution. It did not. The Constitution at that point did not end enslavement of people in Mexico. There were approximately 40,000 enslaved peoples in the Yucatan Peninsula, with the caveat that all children who were born to those 40,000 would be free. So their thinking when they dropped the Constitution is that within a generation, all of these would be free. Of course, it's moot because just 3 years after the Constitution is written and declared, Vicente Guerrero, the third president of Mexico, who is himself Afro-mestizo, declared all enslaved peoples free in 1829. This is what happens on the eve of the U.S. war of aggression against Mexico in 1846. Sorry. What would it mean, though, if we thought of the U.S. the war of aggression against Mexico to be at least as important as the Civil War? And now, remember, the United States gets 1/3 of its landmass from that war, right? But what is the nature of that war? That's a colonial war. That is an imperialist war. There is no redemptive history that can be written if you give that war equal weight. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to talk about how we finally ended slavery, in 1865, but it's a very different thing if you put these two wars in conversation with each other. Because at the same time that we were freeing the enslaved, we were also annexing in a war of aggression, half of Mexico. What happened to the mass of people who were annexed, the mass of Mexicans who were annexed? The majority of, when Mexico signs the treaty, obviously under duress, they lost the war and give up half of their territory. What is in Articles 8 and 9 of the treaty is that Mexicans annexed into the United States would continue to enjoy all of the rights of citizens. But that means property, voting, holding office, etc., that they enjoyed as Mexican citizens. So they incorporate Articles 8 and 9. There's the protests going on outside my window. I don't know if you can hear them. Go! So what ends up happening instead, though, however, is that when the U.S. annexed these people, they simply cannot believe that Mexicans considered Afro-mestizos and indigenous to be fully human and fully citizen. After the U.S. Civil War, the Naturalization Act of 1870 declares that only whites and blacks can become U.S. citizens, can naturalize as U.S. citizens. Right? This is in recognition to the end of the Civil War. But that's not a benign act. It's not just a coincidence. I mean, that they choose that language very, very, very explicitly, because they simply could have said that everyone who comes to the United States can be naturalized regardless of race or creed. But in fact, the Congress spends a lot of time arguing that it cannot use that language. It cannot say that anyone coming to the United States can be naturalized, because we'll be overwhelmed by the Asian hordes, that's their language, obviously not mine, or that will have to extend citizenship to Native Americans. Remember, Native Americans don't get citizenship in this country until 1924. So, it's this crazy, logic that says that, absolutely only blacks and whites can naturalize for citizenship. So what happens to this category of Mexican who, whether or not they are actually miscegenated, understand themselves as a racially mixed collection, a motley crew of peoples? Well, the first case for naturalization is in Rey Rodriguez in 1896 by a Mexican who was actually an immigrant. He hadn't been annexed. He had immigrated from Mexico into Texas, and he tries to be. He makes a petition to be naturalized, and the lower court denies it. And so when he takes it up to the state court rules in his favor, but not because he thinks that Ricardo Rodriguez is white. This is what the judge decides. Ricardo Rodriguez is clearly one of these Latinized Indians who has already accepted the racial ideology of Mexico, that all Mexicans are Mexican. He's a pure-blooded Mexican. Of course, he knows he's not an Aztec, because, the Aztecs are the Nahuas people, and he probably knows enough to know that whatever his indigenous ancestry, it wasn't Nahuatl, it wasn't Nahuas. So, but my point here is, the judge decides that he's white because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that he has the right to naturalize, that he's white by treaty. But clearly, even in that decision, the judge is absolutely flummoxed by his racial character. And the racial character of Ricardo Rodriguez comes into his whiteness, even as it's declared that he can naturalize, that Mexicans, and by extension other Latinos, can naturalize. They're considered part of the white race. But my argument, or what I'm trying to suggest to you, is that being white, it came with this tinge of the copper-colored red man, right? I mean, Mexicans were white by treaty, but they weren't really white. If you wanted to maintain your land, maintain your right to vote, or maintain your right to hold office, and you were in the annexed territory and you were Mexican, you had to prove you were white. Literally go to court and establish that there was no more than 1/32nd, I don't even know how you say it, that you were no more than 1/32nd either black or indigenous. But this is part of the reason why you have this kind of historical suspicion of Mexicans, I think, right? Because you have this incentive within the law to identify with whiteness if you want to be recognized and fully enfranchised, right? Now, I'm sorry, the third part of the lecture we never got to, because that's the part of the civil rights cases where, initially civil rights attorneys argue and win that Mexicans have been discriminated as another white group. And in 1972, they changed their tactic. They insist Mexicans are another minority, a racial minority, an ethnic minority. They win a case in 1972, and that changes everything.
But so one of the things I'm asking is because it seems like right now we're at this moment where so much of Latinidad is just being imagined as white if it is not black, right? And I think that there's some advantages to that, like Lorgia talks about it, right? The necessity to recenter indigeneity and blackness in conceptualizations of Latinidad, right? But I'm saying that because I think that right now, when we think about Mexicans, I would argue that the majority of them in the U.S. are brown, because precisely like you said, 8 million of them are coming from indigeneity. But can you speak to a little bit about that U.S. racial binary thinking and the low social location of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I do think that that's what I was saying. Like the ideology in Mexico is one of mestizaje, which has its own inherent racism, right? Because it privileges the person who's been mixed with whiteness over the indigenous, right? But it privileges mixture. In the United States, we abjure mixture, right? I mean, until relatively recently, biraciality wasn't even a category that was recognized. I think it just got on the census like 1 or 2 censuses ago, right? So, you were either white or you're black, you were either indigenous or you were white or you were black, in other words, there isn't the one drop rule in Mexico. And I think that makes it very confusing for a lot of Latinos, like not beyond Mexicans, right? Because there are Latin American countries where it's really majority Afro-Mestizo, and Latin American countries where it's majority Indigenous, and Latin American countries where it's majority white, right? So even within Latin America, depending on how colonization took place, you have real differences. So, I mean, I think that the U.S. Latino is, and even more specifically the Mexican American, it places a kind of an epistemological challenge. Like, what does it mean when you are, actually the descendant of, both white and indigenous peoples? Or when you're actually the descendant of indigenous peoples, but somewhere along the way, you simply lost your indigenous cultural habits, right? I mean, there is not there's the U.S. system of racialization cannot recognize either of those two categories. This is why I wanted to bring in the issue of, like, when the United States Congress had a choice of saying, let's simply enfranchise everyone, they said, oh, no. We don't want to let the brown people in, right? We don't want to let the yellow and the brown people in. We don't want to let the red people in. We just want whites. We have to let in blacks, and we only want to limit it to white and black. So racialization in this country has never been a bipolar thing. Another thing that's always very important to cite, in the Southwest, between 1870 and 1930, proportionally, Mexicans were lynched at the same rate as African Americans in the South, right? Again, because who are the other in the Southwest? It's the Mexicans, right? That's who you're going to lynch. Blacks aren't numerous enough to even be a threat at that point, right? So who do you lynch? You lynch the Mexicans.
Where would you say some of the key openings Mexican Americans and more broadly Latinos have right now to further radical change in the U.S.? Where are some of, like, the when you key in, like some of the issues or solidarities or affinities there are to be mined?
I think that two things that immediately spring to mind. One is just, the importance of, transforming immation laws so that all of these undocumented people can be enfranchised, and hopefully hopefully after November, we might be able to have a conversation about that. Also, the elimination of IRA, which are the category that IRA was passed in 1996, and it criminalized all sorts of very low grade behavior that gets you deported if you're an undocumented immigrant or if you're a documented immigrant, right? So all of this huge panoply of, like, low level drug crimes gets you deported. And that, that these are people who have lived their whole lives in the United States. They might be undocumented, but they really are U.S., and they get deported because of these. So changing immigration, changing deportation laws, that's a very important, for me, point of activism. Between African American and Latinos, changing the drug laws. Like, what we see as the kind of militarization of the police in the United States that is a consequence of police stations being sold, all of the excess equipment in these, like, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's why our police forces got so militarized, because there's all of these excess of war goods and they're selling them to these departments, right? And so one of the ways that we can combat, like, remembering that the ending, defunding the police has to go beyond just the police brutality against U.S. citizenships. We have to think of it globally, right? How does this police brutality also impact the way in which ICE runs its detention centers, right? The fact that the ICE agents were called, and were some of the most brutal people, called to Washington, D.C. to put down the protest so that the president could have his photo op, right? So that's all one economy. Detention, incarceration, that's one economy.
Do you think we're getting to a place where activism will be taking on more kind of transnational, global proportions?
I hope so. I mean, if we attack drug laws here, and then by extension, if we decriminalize the use of drugs here, then by extension, why are we criminalizing it in Latin America? And you have a lot of Latin American heads of state that, as soon as they leave office, what do they say? Let's legalize it, man. This is bullshit. As soon as they get out of office, they're very happy to talk about legalizing it continentally,
already in between like the sessions, we've just been getting so much response. So like next year I was like, yo, we're gonna do this again, but we're just gonna bring these professors out here to do some work. Which I'm just letting you know that, so
Okay.
you
I'm
can start
also
planning.
happy to come back next weekend. I mean, I'm in my home just like you guys are.
Great. Well, we might hold you to that. I want to thank you so much. Everybody put your emoji clap hands together for Josie Saldana. Check out nyu.edu/SCA for more of our publications. We'll be sharing them as well. I'm going to drop a link for you all to give us some feedback on how you felt about the session and what you learned in the Facebook comments and also in the Zoom chat. And thank you so much, Josie. And we'll be seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.